2 hours after burying my 6-year-old son Audrey, my phone rang with a call that changed my life forever. The trembling voice of his teacher, Kiera Fuller, could barely hold itself together as she whispered, "Abigail, I found something you need to see with your own eyes. Come to the school right now. Don't tell Riley or anyone else. This is dangerous." When I finally arrived, the figure I saw cornering Kiera in the teacher's lounge made me shudder from head to toe. It was my own husband, Riley. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you're watching from in the comment section. Let me start at the beginning. 2 hours after laying Audrey to rest, the house felt like a frozen hell. The piercing scent of lilies mixed with the smell of damp earth clinging to my black dress. People drifted in and out, murmuring hollow words about God's will and how Audrey was finally at peace. None of it could soothe the pain ripping through my chest. Audrey had been a healthy, restless 6-year-old. The doctor claimed it was a massive heart attack, a rare anomaly, and though I didn't believe it, I had no strength left to argue. I took refuge in my bedroom, staring at a photo of Audrey's messy-haired smile. Outside, Riley received visitors with red eyes and slumped shoulders, looking like a man carrying the weight of the world. Everyone praised his strength, calling him an exemplary husband and father. Through the door, I saw him hugging Mr. Logan Whittle, the foundation president. The scene should have moved me, but a wave of nausea turned my stomach instead. That was when my phone vibrated. Kiera's voice was ragged with fear as she begged me to meet her, stressed that I must trust no one. My mother's instinct, previously hitting a wall of helplessness, ignited with brutal clarity. Feigning a fatigue heavier than my grief, I told Riley and Mr. Whittle I needed fresh air to deal with a migraine. Riley offered to go for me with a tenderness that would have convinced a saint, but I insisted on being alone. As I drove toward the school through a dark, rainy infinity, seeds of doubt began cracking through my denial. I remembered Audrey's sudden stomach aches and how Riley had insisted on personally handling his medicine, refusing any doctor who wasn't a cousin of Mr. Whittle. The sinister puzzle was beginning to align. The school looked ominous in the downpour. I parked far away under a massive oak and ran toward the building, my heart hammer-striking my ribs. In the dark hallway, a thread of light escaped from the lounge door. I held my breath and peeked inside. Kiera was cornered against the filing cabinets, her face pale with terror. Standing before her was a man in a black shirt, his back to me, the scent of his cologne unbearably familiar. He held a small black USB drive and spoke with a cold menace I had never heard in 10 years of marriage. The hinges creaked as I pushed the door. Riley spun around, and the neon light illuminated his face. My legs went weak as I stared at the man who had just stood over our son's grave. His icy expression transformed instantly into a mask of grief. He hid the device as Kiera cried silently. Riley claimed he had only come to collect Audrey's things, a touching lie that might have worked if I hadn't seen Kiera's wide eyes. When Riley glanced at her with a threatening glint, she hurried to confirm his version with a broken voice. Riley slid his arm around my shoulders, squeezing with an insistence that hurt, and told me we should go home. As he reached for a box of drawings, he tucked the black object into his pocket. Before we left, Kiera rushed to fix the lace on my shoulder. Her freezing fingers grazed my neck as she slid a small, folded paper into my dress. Her eyes locked onto mine, and though her lips made no sound, I read the word clearly, "Run." I nodded as if thanking her, my heart racing as Riley watched us with suspicion. We left Kiera alone in that silent room, a wax statue melting from the heat of fear. The drive back from the school was a journey toward an invisible execution, the silence inside the car punctuated only by the rhythmic, taunting hiss of the windshield wipers. Riley drove with a studied, eerie calm, occasionally wiping his eyes with a theatrical flourish as if drying fresh tears for an audience of one. He even put on the classical music he always used to relax, but to my ears, the strings sounded like a funeral march for my own destiny. I sat in the passenger seat, my hand instinctively clutching the fold of the lace where Kiera had tucked the paper. It felt like a burning coal against my skin, a physical weight that threatened to pull me under the waves of my own panic. Every time I looked at Riley sideways, I didn't see the man I had shared 10 years of my life with. I saw a complete stranger, a monster wearing the skin of my husband. When we arrived home, the house was quieter, though a few lingering relatives were still gathered in the backyard, their voices low murmurs in the damp night. I feigned a fresh wave of dizziness, claiming I needed to lie down immediately. Riley, ever the attentive caretaker, offered to make me a cup of tea, but I rejected him with a sharpness that I hoped he'd mistake for exhaustion. I retreated to the bedroom and locked the door, leaning my back against the wood until I heard his footsteps fade toward the kitchen. With hands that shook so violently I could barely grip the paper, I pulled out the note. The handwriting was rushed, nearly illegible, as if the pen itself had been trembling. Zion didn't have heart problems, it read. They changed his medicine for low doses of poison. Check the teddy bear. He recorded something. Be careful. Riley is dangerous. The world didn't just crash, it evaporated. My knees gave way, and I collapsed onto the floor, the air leaving my lungs in a silent, agonizing sob. Audrey, my little Audrey, hadn't been taken by an anomaly. He had been systematically erased by the man making tea in the room next door. The grief that had paralyzed me for days hardened instantly into a cold, diamond-sharp rage. I didn't have time to cry anymore. I only had time to survive. I forced myself up and turned on the small television in the corner of the room to provide background noise, just in case Riley was listening at the door. I began to pace, trying to plan my next move, when a sudden news bulletin cut through the late-night programming. The announcer's voice was clinical, detached from the horror of the words she was delivering. A body had been found in the courtyard of the Magnolia Street Elementary School. The victim was identified as Kiera Fuller. The preliminary hypothesis, the reporter said with a practiced frown, was suicide, a tragic leap from the third-floor roof. A scream fought to erupt from my throat, but I stifled it with my palms, my nails digging into my cheeks until I tasted blood. They had killed her. Riley and Whittle had cornered her the moment I left, and now they were painting her as a woman broken by the death of her student. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. If I had fought harder, if I had refused to leave the lounge, she might still be breathing. But I had walked away, and in doing so, I had signed her death warrant. I looked at the locked door, hearing the faint clink of a teacup against a saucer in the hallway. Riley was coming. He was coming to play the grieving widower again, perhaps even to offer me a cup of the very medicine that had ended my son's life. The realization settled over me with a chilling clarity. Kiera was gone, and the evidence she tried to give me was likely the only thing that could stop them. I was no longer just a mother or a wife. I was the last witness standing between Riley and his perfect, blood-stained life. I wiped my face and moved toward the bed, pulling the covers up to my chin just as the doorknob began to jiggle. I had to be perfect. I had to be the broken, submissive Abigail for just a little longer. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, but there was nowhere to go yet. I had to find that teddy bear. I had to hear my son's voice one last time, not as a memory, but as the evidence that would send his father to the gallows. As Riley's shadow appeared under the door, I realized the haunting hadn't begun for him yet, but for me, the nightmare was only just entering its second act. The unbearable pain that had torn me apart until then transformed into something harder and sharper, a cold, focused rage. My tears dried up instantly as I understood that crying could wait, the truth could not. I got up as best I could and tiptoed out of my room, heading toward Audrey's bedroom, which was situated right next to the master suite. I opened the door with agonizing care, the hinges barely whispering against the silence of the house. Inside, the air was still thick with the scent of baby cologne and lotion, a smell so familiar it caused my heart to shrink in my chest. Everything in the room remained exactly as my 6-year-old had left it, building blocks scattered on the floor, superhero posters guarding the walls, and storybooks left open on the nightstand. Sitting in the center of the bed was his large brown teddy bear, the one he had hugged every single night to sleep, a gift I had given him for his birthday 2 years ago. I approached the toy, my hands shaking so violently I could barely reach out to touch its soft fur. As I caressed the bear, my fingers snagged on something unusual along its back, a seam that felt thick and uneven, as if someone had opened and closed it in a desperate hurry with clumsy, jagged stitches. I remembered that Audrey had been taught basic sewing at school and occasionally practiced on his toys, but this felt different, more frantic. I moved to his small desk, fumbling through a drawer until I found a pair of nail clippers with a small metal file. Returning to the bed, I began to unstitch the bear with surgical precision. Amidst the white fiber stuffing, a small digital recorder appeared, a spy toy that our friend Charlie had given Audrey long ago. Audrey had always loved playing detective, a childhood game that had now turned into a grim legacy. I felt a physical chill wash over me as I pressed the play button. Audrey's voice emerged first, sounding weak and unnervingly hoarse, a haunting departure from the cheerful tone that used to fill our home. "Today, my tummy hurt again after Dad gave me the red medicine," he whispered into the microphone. "It tastes really bitter, not like the one Mom gives me. I'm scared to tell Mom. Dad says it's a super vitamin to make me strong, but I feel worse every time." The audio continued, and the sound of a door opening followed by heavy rhythmic footsteps filled the room. Then, I clearly heard Riley's voice. He wasn't speaking to Audrey, he was on the phone, his tone terrifyingly calm, almost bored. "Don't worry, Mr. Whittle," Riley said into the receiver. "I already upped the dose. The kid won't make it to next week." My breath hitched in my throat, but the recording didn't stop there. Riley continued, "As soon as he dies, his grandfather's inheritance is released to the guardian's account, meaning mine. Then we split it 50-50 like we agreed. You just make sure the paperwork for the foundation property is ready to change names." The recording cut off, and the silence that followed was deafening. I covered my mouth with both hands to contain a scream that was fighting to claw its way out of my throat. The room felt like it was spinning. Riley, the man I had loved and shared 10 years of my life with, had systematically poisoned our son to steal the inheritance my father had left in Audrey's name. And the respectable Mr. Logan Whittle, the pillar of our community and president of the foundation, was his willing accomplice. They weren't men, they were monsters lurking behind masks of grief and philanthropy. At that exact instant, the doorknob to Audrey's room began to jiggle. Someone was trying to enter, but I had instinctively locked it behind me. "Abigail." Riley's voice called out from the other side. "Why is the door locked? Are you in there? Open it." His tone had shifted completely. The sweetness of the grieving husband was gone, replaced by a hard, veiled threat. He began to bang on the wood insistently. "Open up, Abigail. Don't make me break it down." I backed away toward the window, clutching the teddy bear and the recorder against my chest. My son's killer was standing on the other side of that door, and the most terrifying part was that he likely knew I had finally discovered his secret. The heavy blows against the wood became brutal, each impact making the superhero posters on the walls vibrate as if the room itself were trembling in fear. Riley was screaming my name with a voice disfigured by rage and panic, a roar that mixed desperation and cruelty in a way I had never heard before. I knew that as soon as he managed to get in, my life would be hanging by a single frayed thread. He was no longer the man I had married. He was a cornered animal, willing to destroy anything or anyone that could expose the poison he had fed our son. I tucked the small digital recorder, the only thing I now had to demand justice, into the inner pocket of my tunic, feeling its cold weight against my ribs. The door groaned under the pressure, the wood beginning to splinter. I had to find another way out, and the door was out of the question. I turned toward the window. Audrey's room was on the second floor, and I remembered the thick sycamore tree growing just outside the small balcony. Its branches reached close enough that Audrey had often tried to climb them, a childish mischief I had once scolded him for, but which might now be my only salvation. I ran to the window, unlocked the latch with trembling hands, and threw it wide open to the night. The air hit my face like a bucket of ice water, heavy with a torrential rain that masked the sound of the door finally giving way. Without giving myself time to think or fear the height, I climbed onto the balcony railing and felt for a wet, slippery branch with my foot. I launched myself into the dark, clinging to the rough bark with both hands until it scratched my palms raw. My soaked tunic got caught on a thin twig, and I pulled with all my strength until I heard the fabric tear, the sound lost in a crash from inside the room. Riley had broken through. I looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, bathed in the overhead light, looking like a ghost of the man I once knew. He ran to the balcony, cursing loudly as he searched the darkness, but the curtain of rain and the shadows of the sycamore kept me hidden. I slid down the trunk, my feet finally touching the muddy grass of the garden. I didn't waste a second. Barefoot and shivering, I slipped along the side wall of the house toward the back garden gate. I knew that as soon as Riley discovered I wasn't in the room, he would wake the security guards or call Mr. Whittle. Every shadow seemed like an enemy lying in wait, and every rustle of the leaves felt like a hand reaching for my throat. With my heart racing and tears mixing with the rain on my face, I managed to open the gate and stepped out onto the dark path behind the subdivision. I ran without looking back, the recorder clutched tightly in my pocket, until I reached the main avenue a mile away. My phone, soaked in my pocket, vibrated incessantly with missed calls from Riley, but I refused to answer. I couldn't leave him even the slightest clue of where I was. Taking shelter under the awning of a closed shop, gasping for air and numb from the cold, I searched my contact list for the only name I could still trust, Charlie. He was an investigative journalist, stubborn and used to dealing with the kind of dirty cases that involved men like Riley and Whittle. I dialed his number with shaking hands, praying he wasn't asleep. When he finally answered, his voice was thick with sleep until he heard my broken sobbing. "Charlie, help me," I whispered, the words like broken glass in my throat. "Riley killed Audrey. I'm near the gas station on the highway. Come get me. Just come fast." I hung up and turned off the phone immediately so it couldn't be tracked. I curled up in a dark corner next to the shop's metal shutter, hugging my knees and shaking with a terror that no blanket could warm. Every pair of headlights that approached made my heart stop, expecting to see Riley's black SUV. 15 minutes felt like 15 years until a familiar old gray sedan pulled up. I saw Charlie's worried face through the window and jumped into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut as if the car itself were a fortress. I must have looked pitiful, soaked, covered in mud, with scratched hands and a face pale as a ghost. Charlie shot me a quick glance, understood the gravity of the situation, and sped off into the night without asking a single question. Inside the car, the blast of the heater made me shiver even more as the adrenaline began to dump from my system. Charlie drove with one hand and squeezed mine with the other, his presence the first anchor of safety I had felt since the funeral began. I started telling him everything. The call from Kiera, the scene at the school, the recorder in the bear, and the betrayal that had poisoned my family from within. When I finally played the audio for him, Charlie pulled the car over to the curb and listened in a silence that grew heavier with every word from Riley and Whittle. When it finished, he hit the steering wheel in a rage, his face transforming into the cold, calculated mask of a journalist who had found his mission. He knew we couldn't go to the police yet. Whittle's influence was too deep. He decided to take me to a safe house, an apartment on the outskirts of the city that belonged to his late uncle, a place where we could become the hunters. In the dusty silence of the safe house, the submissive Abigail who had stood by a casket died, and a hunter was born in her place. Charlie and I spent the pre-dawn hours meticulously dismantling my identity. I cut my hair to my shoulders and traded my morning lace for the anonymous, oversized uniform of a maintenance worker. Charlie, utilizing his investigative resources, hacked into the system of the external cleaning company that serviced the corporate building of Logan Whittle's foundation. By sunrise, I had been inserted into the temporary staff list as Sad Day, a woman designed to be invisible, one of the many people at the bottom whom the powerful never bothered to truly look at. I powdered my face to dull my features, donned thick-rimmed glasses, and tied a dark, practical hijab that obscured the woman Riley thought he knew. When I pushed my cart of buckets and mops through the service entrance of the corporate tower, my heart was a drum in my chest, but my hands remained steady. The security guard didn't even lift his head from his register as I passed, my cloned access card granting me entry into the den of the men who had stolen my son's breath. I took the freight elevator to the executive floor, the carpeted hallways smelling of expensive wax and the cold, sterile scent of corporate success. My target was the expansive suite shared by the director of operations and the foundation president. I swiped into Riley's office, the lock clicking with a sound like a hammer cocking on a gun. The room was elegant, dominated by dark wood and a sprawling view of the city that seemed to mock my grief. On the wall hung a photograph of our family, Riley, Audrey, and me, smiling in a park. It was a sickening piece of theater, a mask hung on a wall to project a soul Riley didn't possess. I moved quickly, my fingers finding the abstract painting that hid the safe. I punched in the code, Audrey's birthday, and the light turned green, revealing stacks of cash and property transfers that confirmed their corruption, though not yet the murder. I photographed every document with a tiny camera hidden in my uniform button, my breathing shallow as I realized the red medicine bottle had likely already been destroyed. Suddenly, the sound of laughter and clicking heels echoed from a hallway, and I barely had time to close the safe and retreat behind a large sofa, pretending to scrub the baseboards. The door swung open, and Riley walked in, followed by Amber, his secretary. There was no mask of contained pain now. Riley was laughing, the sound jagged and cruel as he poured 2 glasses of whiskey. Amber sat on the edge of the desk, stroking his arm with a familiarity that suggested she had been part of his shadow life for a long time. I activated the recording microphone in my pocket, my nails digging into my palms as I listened to them speak of my son's death as if it were a successful business merger. Amber praised Riley's performance at the funeral, telling him that even Mr. Whittle had been impressed by his act. Riley took a deep pull from his glass, a smirk playing on his lips as he called Audrey a burden and a source of unnecessary expense that had finally been cleared away. He spoke of the inheritance millions as if they were already in his account, mocking my desperate flight and predicting that I would soon be found dead, another victim of grief-induced madness. "And there's nothing they can prove," Riley added, leaning in to kiss Amber's temple. "I sent the poison bottle to be incinerated with a medical waste this morning. No trace left." Hearing those words, the arrogant admission of my son's murder, felt like a low blow that nearly took my legs out from under me. They believed they had one. They believed they were untouchable in their tower of glass and wood. I waited in the shadows until they left for lunch, my body vibrating with a rage so intense it felt like electricity. Before I slipped out of the office, I took a small toy car of Audrey's from my pocket and placed it squarely in the center of Riley's desk, right on top of his organized files. I wanted him to know that the ghost of his son was no longer resting. As I navigated back to the service exit, I knew the evidence we had was powerful, but it wasn't enough to just convict them. I wanted to see them consume themselves with the same fear they had forced upon a 6-year-old boy. The most effective way to make a criminal commit mistakes is to provoke fear, and we knew that Riley, cold as he was, had a single jagged crack in his armor, a deep-seated terror of the supernatural and the idea that bad deeds eventually return to haunt the doer. In the early years of our marriage, he had confessed that ghost stories terrified him and that he was obsessed with the concept of karma, a fear he tried to drown in cynicism and stolen money, but one that still lurked beneath the surface. From the safety of our dusty operations center, Charlie managed to hack into the smart home system Riley had installed in our house, granting us total control over the lights, cameras, audio, and climate control. We turned the very technology he had implemented for his security into a weapon designed to drive him toward a total mental collapse. The haunting began at midnight. From the laptop screen, we watched the living room camera as Riley poured himself yet another drink, his movements uneasy as he kept glancing at Audrey's toy car, which I had left on his office desk and he had brought home in a fit of confusion. Charlie made the living room lights flicker with a rhythmic, pulsing intensity. Riley stood up, bewildered, checking the switches with trembling fingers, but as soon as he seemed to calm himself, we escalated the pressure. He retreated to the bedroom, and we immediately dropped the air conditioning temperature to a bone-chilling 60 degrees. We watched him shiver beneath the covers, his eyes darting toward every shadow. Then, through the ceiling speakers, we played a soft, digitized giggle of Audrey's, mixed with the hollow white noise of the ventilation fan. Riley sat up instantly, his eyes wide and wild as he scanned the dark corners for the source of the sound. "Who's there?" he shouted into the empty room, his voice cracking with a desperation he could no longer hide. We cut the audio the moment he spoke, leaving him in a silence more terrifying than the noise itself. We repeated this game over the following nights, never letting him sleep for more than a few minutes at a time, slowly eroding his grip on reality. On the third day, the pressure reached a breaking point. While Riley was in the shower, we filled the small, tiled bathroom with the recording of Audrey's whimpers from the final days, the sounds of his pain when the medicine was tearing his stomach apart. The echo against the tiles made the whimpers sound ghostly and omnipresent. Riley burst out of the shower, slipping on the wet floor and clutching the furniture for support, his face as white as marble and his eyes filled with a primal horror. He began to scream for the voices to leave him alone, his mind unable to distinguish between technology and the restless dead. In his delirium, mistrust began to germinate between the conspirators. Riley began calling Amber and Mr. Logan Whittle at all hours, accusing them of playing cruel jokes or trying to blackmail him. Every unexplained sound or flickering light became a sign of betrayal. He was no longer the director of operations or the grieving father. He was a cornered, exhausted animal, looking for a specter at his back. We watched through the cameras as he started pacing the hallways, a glass of whiskey in one hand and a heavy flashlight in the other, talking to himself as he hunted for a ghost we were feeding him through a fiber-optic cable. Charlie and I watched the screen with a mix of satisfied rage and cold determination. We knew this was only the preparation for the final stage. Riley was becoming a social pariah within the walls of his own home, consumed by the same fear he had forced Audrey to live through in his final weeks. By the time the Foundation's annual gala arrived, Riley was a shell of a man, his confidence shattered and his paranoia peaking. He was ready to be broken in public. We had the evidence, we had the recordings, and now we had a man so terrified of his own shadow that he would soon be unable to distinguish between a prosecutor and a ghost. The stage was set for the ultimate reckoning. The culmination of our plan coincided with the Foundation's Grand Gala, a night of forced opulence held at a luxury hotel where the city's elite gathered to celebrate their own perceived virtue. Mr. Logan Whittle was set to give a keynote speech, and Riley was to be presented with an award as an exemplary father for continuing to support the institution despite his personal tragedy. The very title of the recognition made my blood run cold, a bitter irony that only fueled the fire of my resolve. While the guests sipped expensive champagne, Charlie found a breach in the hotel's Wi-Fi network, gaining total access to the projection and sound system. They had planned a sentimental video montage featuring photos of Audrey's smiling face, but we had prepared a very different feature, a compilation of their own moral rot. Charlie and I watched the ballroom through the hotel's security cameras from a van parked in the lot, our screens illuminated by the cold blue light of the surveillance feeds. We saw Riley enter beside Mr. Whittle, and even through the grainy footage, the change in him was palpable. He looked undone, haggard, and hunched over, his head twitching every few seconds as if he expected a specter to materialize at his shoulder. Amber was there as well, looking radiant but visibly annoyed by Riley's erratic behavior and sudden mood swings. When Riley was finally called to the stage, the audience erupted in polite, sympathetic applause. He took the microphone, his voice trembling as he began a rehearsed, broken-hearted monologue about how much he missed his son. I looked at Charlie and gave the signal. Suddenly, the giant screen behind Riley, which was supposed to show Audrey in the park, filled with static and a sharp, piercing screech that silenced the room. The screen turned an intense, visceral red, and enormous letters appeared as if written in blood, "I know what you did." Riley froze, turning pale as a corpse as the ballroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Before he could speak, we unleashed the recording I had captured in his office, the audio of him laughing with Amber, calling Audrey a burden, and bragging about incinerating the poison bottle. The sound of his own voice, arrogant and cruel, filled the hall, echoing off the high ceilings and the horrified faces of the guests. The attendees were left jaw-dropped, chairs dragged across the floor as people stood up in indignation, a wave of low, angry murmurs rising through the crowd. Amber stood up, swaying as if she were about to faint, while Mr. Whittle's face turned a deep, mottled red with rage and shame. Riley tried to grab the microphone again, shouting that it was a setup and a digital slander, but his voice was drowned out by the collective gasps of the people he had spent years deceiving. The breaking point came when Riley saw Mr. Whittle whisper something urgently to the head of security. He realized in a flash of clarity that Whittle was going to use him as a scapegoat, abandoning him to the public outcry to save the Foundation's image. "You!" Riley roared from the stage, pointing a shaking finger at Whittle. "It was you who planned it. The inheritance money, the poison, you told me to up the dose because of your gambling debts." That accusation, caught by hundreds of cell phone cameras and the local news crews, was a bell that could never be unrung. The gala descended into total chaos. Riley escaped through the service exit, pursued by a swarm of journalists, while Whittle tried in vain to control the spiraling situation. Within hours, the video of the confession and the subsequent stage-side breakdown went viral, turning the city's favorite exemplary father into a social pariah. However, Charlie and I knew this public shaming was only the beginning. Lawyers would already be claiming stress and deepfakes. We needed a final, undeniable admission made in the presence of the law. We went back to our safe house not to celebrate, but to prepare for the final trap, knowing that a wounded and cornered animal is at its most dangerous. The next phase of the plan consisted of pitting the two monsters against each other, making them believe the other was the ultimate betrayer. Charlie prepared 2 burner phones, and on the first, we sent a message to Mr. Whittle disguised as Riley, claiming to have signed copies of all asset diversion papers and demanding a meeting at the Foundation's old warehouse at the docks at 2 a.m. On the other phone, we pretended to be an emissary of Whittle, telling Riley that a boat had been prepared to get him out of the country, provided he brought all evidence to the same location. We knew that Riley, desperate and convinced the world was closing in, would see this as his last lifeline. By 2 a.m., under a fierce, unrelenting rain, Charlie and I were positioned on a metal loft inside the abandoned warehouse, which smelled of rust and stale seawater. Charlie had placed hidden cameras and microphones throughout the building, connected to a secure server that a contact in the Major Crimes Unit was monitoring in real time. This time, the police were in the loop. They just had to wait for the confession to be absolute. Whittle arrived first in a black sedan, entering the warehouse with his hand gripped inside his jacket, clearly holding a weapon. Moments later, Riley entered from the darkness, his gaze lost and his clothes wrinkled, looking as if he had aged a decade in 2 days. "Where's the boat?" Riley asked with a broken voice, but Whittle only responded with a dry, cruel laugh. Whittle accused Riley of humiliating him at the hotel and demanded the documents he thought Riley was using for blackmail. The confusion between them quickly turned into a violent fury as they realized they had been lured there, but their mutual hatred was now stronger than their survival instinct. Riley spat that Whittle was just as responsible for Audrey's death, shouting that Whittle had provided the poison and instructed him to up the dose to cover gambling debts. Whittle roared back that Riley was the one who put the poison in the boy's mouth every night. Every word was broadcast live to the police. Suddenly, Whittle pulled out his gun and aimed it at Riley's head, but before he could fire, police sirens shattered the silence of the docks. Red and blue lights filtered through the warehouse cracks as a megaphone ordered them to surrender. Riley lunged at Whittle, and the two rolled on the floor in a brutal struggle until the gun was kicked into a dark corner. Riley, younger and fueled by a manic desperation, beat Whittle until the older man was unconscious. Instead of surrendering, Riley stood up unsteadily and scanned the room, his eyes catching a glint of light on our camera lens in the loft. "Abigail!" he roared, finally recognizing the ghost that had been haunting him. Crazed, he charged toward the stairs as Charlie grabbed my arm, telling me to run through the roof door. We reached the warehouse roof under the torrential rain, but Riley kicked the door open, brandishing a metal bar. He dealt a brutal blow to Charlie's arm, and I heard a sickening crack as my friend fell to the ground in agony. Riley grabbed me by the lace of my dress, dragging me toward the edge of the roof to use me as a shield against the officers entering the building. He forced me down the fire escape and pushed me into a passenger seat of an old SUV parked between shipping containers, tying my hands to the roof handle with his own necktie. He peeled out like a madman, several cruisers immediately giving chase. Riley drove as if he valued neither of our lives, running red lights and hitting puddles that made the car skid dangerously toward the void. "I'm not going to rot in jail," he muttered deliriously as we took an elevated viaduct that was still under construction. Ahead, the flashes of a police barricade blocked our path, and as Riley jerked the steering wheel to avoid them, the car lost all traction. The world spun in a blur of metal and glass until the vehicle slammed into a retaining wall, the airbags deploying with a deafening thud. Dazed and bleeding, Riley managed to stumble out and drag me with him toward the very edge of the viaduct. Below, the dark, roaring current of the river waited. He pressed a shard of broken glass to my throat, demanding a helicopter and a clear route from the surrounding police. In that moment, looking at his reflection in a rain puddle, I saw a man devoured by his own ambition. I thought of Audrey, gathered my remaining strength, and bit Riley's forearm with all my accumulated rage. As he screamed and loosened his grip, I kicked him with everything I had in his injured knee. A snap echoed through the air, and Riley fell backward onto the soaked pavement, howling as the police lunged forward to finally pull me away from the edge. The legal chapter of my life concluded under the heavy gavel of a judge whose eyes held no mercy for the men who had stolen my son's future. The trial was a whirlwind of evidence. The recordings from Audrey's bear, the undercover footage from the foundation, and the chilling live broadcast from the warehouse, that left no room for the expensive lawyers to maneuver. Riley was found guilty on all counts, including the premeditated homicide of a minor and the murder of Kiera Fuller. The judge, noting the sheer cruelty of his actions, handed down the maximum penalty. As he was led away in his wheelchair, shaking with a desperate, ugly sob, I felt a serene emptiness take the place of the rage that had sustained me. However, the legal punishment was only the beginning of their reckoning, as if fate itself decided to mirror the agony they had inflicted on a 6-year-old boy. In the prison hospital, the leg Riley had mangled during our struggle on the viaduct became a breeding ground for a severe, antibiotic-resistant infection. The combination of filth from the river and shards of glass had introduced bacteria deep into his bloodstream. Within days, the tissue began to rot, and the doctors were forced to amputate his right leg above the knee to save his life. When he woke from the anesthesia to find his body mutilated, he screamed for the loss of what he had once valued most, his own physical vanity. It was a brutal irony. The man who had systematically destroyed my son's internal organs with poison now lived in a body that was also incomplete. Mr. Logan Whittle did not escape his own prison of flesh. During his first formal statement at the district attorney's office, the mounting pressure spiked his blood pressure to a lethal level, causing a massive stroke. He survived, but the man who had once dominated gala stages with smooth, manipulative speeches was left half-paralyzed and unable to form intelligible words. Reduced to a state of total dependency, he spent his days in a prison infirmary, drooling and bedridden, relying on the hands of strangers for his most basic needs. His family, shamed by the viral exposure of his crimes, washed their hands of him entirely, leaving him to rot in a silent world of his own making. Even Amber, who had believed her beauty and quick betrayal of Riley would grant her a lighter path, found no sanctuary. She was sentenced to 20 years for her role in the cover-up and her benefit from the stolen inheritance. Behind bars, far from the luxury hotels and expensive silks, she discovered that the life she had helped Riley build was as fragile as the glass he had held to my throat. 6 months passed before the wounds in my soul began to truly close, the scars remaining but no longer bleeding. I looked at myself in the mirror of my new home, a simpler place filled with a peace I hadn't felt in years. The woman looking back was no longer the broken mother from the funeral. She was someone hardened by tragedy and risen above it. With the inheritance money recovered after a grueling legal battle led by Charlie, I knew I couldn't keep a single cent for myself. It was stained with my son's blood. Instead, I used it to remodel an old building on the outskirts of the city. At the entrance, I hung a colorful sign that caught the morning light, Audrey's Light, Foundation for Child Protection and Education. It became a refuge for children who, like Audrey, were being silenced or mistreated, a place where they could sleep without fear and play in the sunshine. Walking through the halls, hearing the laughter of children echoing against the freshly painted walls, I felt a kind of quiet joy. In the lobby, I placed a large photograph of Audrey smiling, and beside it, one of Kiera Fuller. Her memory was honored through the Foundation's work and a new library in her name, ensuring she was remembered for her courage rather than her tragedy. One evening, as the sun began to color the sky a deep, vibrant orange, I visited the cemetery. Audrey and Kiera lay side by side under the shade of a magnolia tree, its white flowers leaning protectively over their marble headstones. I crouched before my son's name, running my fingers over the cold stone. "It's done, my love," I whispered into the breeze. "We got justice. You don't have to feel pain anymore." As I stood up, I saw a silhouette at the end of the path. For a fleeting moment in the golden light, I saw a small boy in superhero pajamas, his hair messy and his eyes bright with the energy that had always been contagious. He didn't look sick, he looked radiant. He raised a hand in a small, joyful wave, a final goodbye that told me he was finally, truly okay. I returned the wave with a trembling hand and a sincere smile, the warmth he left in my chest finally outweighing the cold of the past. I turned back to find Charlie waiting for me with his usual silent patience. We walked out of the cemetery together, leaving behind the years of fear and guilt. Ahead of me, the city lights began to flicker on like a new curtain opening. I was no longer just a victim of Riley's greed. I was Abigail Weber, the defender of children who had no voice, and for the first time, the future looked like a place I was ready to inhabit.